level of education and a certain class, it gave you the opportunity to purchase a commission. And commission purchasing was very common in the British Army actually through the Second World War as well. Completely different than our system, but certainly existed in Britain. So Tolkien and his friends were young officers who, well, general second lieutenants don't have a long lifespan in any war, but in the First World War. And he served on the Somme. The Somme is a region in northeastern France and the scene of one of the most climactic battles of the First World War on the Western Front. And while he's on the Somme, he had already begun to, long before the elves, he was a linguist, began to develop the history of the elves, which would become the foundation for Middle-earth and everything tied to it. But he never didn't write the stories that would lead to it yet. He was still working on the language. And while he's on the Somme and in the trenches, he begins, based on his observations, to sort of consciously into his stories. And the very first story that would appear about Middle-earth is the story called Gondolin, being in Tolkien lore, it would be the last city of the elves in the First Age that would fall to Melkor or Morgoth. Right? So if you read Lord of the Rings or see the movies, who's the bad guy? Who's the boss level guy? Sauron, right? Sauron worked for Melkor. If you've gotten to this, but is in Tolkien's universe, in Tolkien's theology, the equivalent of the devil. And so Sauron worked for him. But by the time you get to Lord of the Rings or after the First Age, Morgoth has been cast out of Middle-earth into the void by the equivalent of the Valar, the angels, and the Tolkien equivalent of that. And Sauron was his right-hand man. And so Sauron wants to basically replace him. And that's what the Second Age and the Third Age of Middle-earth are all about, in the Rings of Power, etc. And so Tolkien is sort of putting this all together. And in the Fall of Gondolin, it deals with this last elven city that is a holdout that is unknown to God, but is discovered, and then there is this climactic battle and destruction of Gondolin. This would be almost on the same level as, let's say, the siege of Troy in the Iliad, right? In ancient. Now, Tolkien hated classical Greek literature. He loved Norse mythology, Anglo-Saxon mythology, and actually wrote in his letters how much he didn't like reading Homer. But there's no doubt the heroic epic is there. It influences him. He loved Beowulf, but I don't know if anyone struggles with Beowulf, but I'd rather read Homer any day. For those who are in schools now, read it on your own. You'll understand.
No, don't. Don't waste it. No, don't.
Let them learn through the suffering. While he's on the Western Front in the trenches, Tolkien catches an illness, which is trench fever is what it's called. Could be a whole variety of different illnesses, but he's in hospital at this time. And while he's recovering in hospital and months in hospital, he spends his time writing the story of the Fall of Gondolin. And so this is really the very first story that he puts pen to paper that will become part of the history of Middle-earth. And it's a chapter in the Silmarillion, which of course most people haven't read, so you aren't familiar with it. But Silmarillion, it's already been edited down, rewritten by him, and sort of edited heavily by his son Christopher by the time it's published in the 1970s. But it first is written in 1917 when he's in hospital. Okay. So it's had, if anyone's ever written a rough draft and then worked on it and worked on it and worked on it, right? The final draft does not necessarily always look close to what the rough draft looked like. And so this happens if you read the Silmarillion, you don't get the same, you get a little bit of the imagery that had appeared in 1916, 1917, but it's not as clear as when you look at the initial one. So what I have for you in these 2 pages comes from, as close as we could get to it, it's roughly the 1919 iteration, so it has been edited slightly by Tolkien, but not much. And it's found, you can find it in a collection called the Book of Lost Tales, which takes all of it, sort of like 5 or 6 volumes of it, which works and traces through from the original iterations to what they actually become these stories. And the Book of Lost Tales, The Fall of Gondolin, in its 1919 form, is in fact pretty clear. So if you look at the first page I gave you, which is page 170, 171. 171. We go like halfway through the page. You can see maybe lightly my pencil mark on the side. Halfway down the second paragraph, Melko. Melko was the original name that Tolkien had given for Melkor, who would later be known as Morgoth. Right? So the name itself is evolving over the course of time of Tolkien's. Well, it says, assembled all of his most cunning smiths and sorcerers. This is the plan to take Gondolin. Right? And I think as I read this, think about the imagery here. Right? His most cunning smiths and sorcerers of iron and flame, and they wrought a host of monsters such have been seen and shall not again be till the great end. Some were all of ironly linked, that they might flow like slow rivers of metal, or coil themselves around and above all opposites. And these were filled in their innermost depths with the grimmest of the orcs, with scimitars and spears. Others of bronze and copper were given hearts and spirits of blazing fire, and they bore them with the terror of their snorting, or trampled whatsoever escaped the ardor of their breath. Yet others were creatures of pure flame that writhed like ropes of molten metal, and they brought to ruin whatever fabric they came nigh, and iron and stone melted before as water, and upon them rolled the Balrogs in hundreds, and these were the most dire devised against Gondor. First and foremost, you remember from Lord of the Rings movies, the Balrog in the Mines of Moria, the demon, right? The giant demon of flame with whips that Gandalf fights, right? That's at the end of the first.
Yeah, we talked about this today in the sermon.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So in Lord of the Rings, Balrog's a big thing, and it's a very significant event. But in the first age of Middle Earth, there were Balrogs. The only reason there'll be very few, if any, left by the time is because of the wars in the first age that Tolkien writes about. They are slain. Sorry, they are slain. Most of the Balrogs are slain during the fall of Gondolin. Will be destroyed in the final episode when the Valar come across the sea. Sort of this sort of apocalyptic scene at the end of the Silmarillion, and there's only one or two Balrog left and hiding because they're afraid. And the one that Gandalf finds in the Mines of Moria is one of the last Balrogs that's been hiding for thousands and thousands of years. And then, so if when we look at that scene in Lord of the Rings, either in the book or in the movie, and Jackson did a great job of it, and he built that very vivid descriptions of it. And now imagine hundreds of these things, right? So again, scale, right? First stage scale. But now, if you look at what I just read to you, what are some of the images of rivers of metal coil themselves around all above obstacles, or hearts and spirits of blazing fire? They blasted all that stood before them with terror of their snorting, or trampled whatsoever escaped the ardor of their breath. What is the image that he's portraying when he describes it as such? What, in terms of the First World War, what do you think those that he's describing? Well, flamethrowers, certainly. Flamethrowers. What else? How about steel? What is this? Iron, linked, that they might flow like slow rivers of metal. Not certainly there, and he experienced that. Bombs. Well, certainly that's with the explosions that destroy the fabric, right? And artillery, in addition, right? Tanks, right? Tanks, because tanks made their first appearance on the battlefield in 1916. They were introduced by the British on the battlefield. The Germans had some, not a lot of them, but they're there, right? And so the imagery right here is pretty clear of tanks, of flamethrowers, of artillery, right? But he's writing it within the fabric of the First Age, right? And we see this imagery, and knowing about the First World War, we can see very clearly that this is here. When we get to the Silmarillion's Fall of Gondolin, a lot of this language is softened, and some of it's edited out, so it's not as very clear what he's experiencing on the battlefield. If we go to the second page, 77, right, and we'll start middle of the page. And now came the monsters, white towers of Gondolin, reddened before them. But the stoutest were in dread, seeing those dragons of fire and iron that fare already about the hills of the city, and the arrows at them. Right. So here again, right, this image of dragons of fire. Now, in the 1500s, cannons, artillery were introduced in the middle of the 1400s. The first major use of cannons for the fall of Constantinople. But artillery, field guns or siege guns, become commonplace. In French, the term between basically 1500 and 1800 for a cannon was bouche, which means mouth of fire, right? And so and Tolkien, and then you see later cannon used and artillery later on. But the original term from early modern, mouth of fire, and also the English referred to small cannon that were employed in the by the Elizabethan age as drakes, and a drake is also an English term for a young dragon. So this idea of spewing fire and serpents and dragons is understood in the language, both in in European languages, it means artillery. And then if you play with it as a writer, write around with it, you can this idea, this imagery of dragons, is quite clear. Let's see here. Here we go. Then there is a cry of hope, for behold, the snakes of fire may not climb the hill for its steepness and for its glassiness, and by quenching waters that fall upon the tanks, right, trying to climb, right, if you can't make it up the angle. Then there, here we go. Yes, feet, and as a vast steam arises where the streams of Amon Guareth and the flames of the serpents drive together, there that women became faint beneath their mail, and all the springs of the city fountain of the kings grew hot and smoked. So what's the imagery there that he's when he's talking about the smoke and the steam people pass out? Gas. Right. This is the imagery of gas. But now Gothmog, lord of the Balrogs, captain of the hosts of Mokor, took counsel and gathered all his things of iron that could coil themselves around and above all obstacles before them. These he bade pile themselves before the northern gate, and behold, their great spires reached even at the towers and bastions about it, etc., etc. So you can read these passages particularly, and there are other parts of the chapter of the story, but we only have so much time, that really bring out this imagery of the attack on the Western Front, of these machines of war, of the devastation and the explosion and the flame and the gas. And here it is, Gondolin, again, immediately written while he's recovering in hospital. And he had witnessed this. I have a map also that I've attached to the handout, which comes from a book called Tolkien and the Great War. The book's okay. I mean, in terms of, it doesn't really tell us anything we don't know, but it puts it all nicely together. And it's written pretty well, and it's in paperback, so if you're interested, it shows where Tolkien was and where many of his friends were on the Somme over the course of 1916, June 1916, and lasted until November 1916. But that was the major offensive there. And he was not part of the major, he certainly was part of a supporting offensive. Have any of you seen the wonderful Peter Jackson documentary on World War I called They Shall Not?
I haven't watched it yet.
It is 4 maybe just before COVID. Was it 4 years ago now? So another age. But he focused on the experience of the First World War for British Army in the Western Front. It is probably, in my estimation, the best documentary military history documentary ever made. If you want to get a really good for the average soldier on the Western Front, British soldier, that's something to watch. It used to be on Netflix, and then I think HBO Max did one of the streaming services, and it's worth it. It's an hour and a half. But he not only did he colorize with the proper colors, but he hired lip readers to read the lips of the silent, because the films were silent when they were doing, and they were reading what they were actually saying. And then they did research in the archives to find the exact units. And sometime when there was an officer reading from a book, they found what the orders were. If you had shells exploding, caliber of the artillery piece, and then he had the New Zealander fire off a round to get the sound of what a 155 millimeter cannon would sound like. It's really wonderful. Not just as a historical. Jackson, of course, does this many years after Lord of the Rings, but nonetheless is fascinated with the First World War. And part of that is his own family's history of the First World War, but also his love of Tolkien. Anyone see the movie Tolkien with Nicholas Hoult? That movie's it's not bad. The personal relationships are very good. They completely and purposefully ignore the role of religion, even though they have the priest who's very important in his life there, but they only talk about love. They don't talk about anything else. But they do a good job in showing you visually Tolkien's experiences on the Western Front with some imagery of dragons. But the First World War was very much a part of the stories of the Silmarillion, the first stories that were given. And these massive battles of tens of thousands against tens of thousands, and battles that last and decades, are not in Lord of the Rings. because Lord of the Rings takes place from the Fellowship to the end of Lord of the Rings is about 3-4 month period in the history of Middle Earth. But the wars of the First Age, the wars against Melkor, are place over centuries. Battles that take place over years, and the destruction of not only Morgoth, etc., but it's also the destruction and denigration of the elves. Because by the time we get to Lord of the Rings, the elves are few and far between. But they were the primary characters in the Silmarillion and Tolkien's universe, but they are played as a major in the first bin, and what should have been the promise of a new age in the 20th century, and how it's destroyed on the battlefields of the First World War. And this is something that, again, that we don't sort of subsequent writing. We certainly don't see it in The Hobbit. We only hear aspects of it, but it was very much something that became part of the Silmarillion, and is ever present in the Silmarillion. And so Tolkien's experience in the First World War directly affected not only the emergence of Middle Earth, the story that reflected his own personal experiences, but it forever shaped his perspective of good versus evil. And we see this also called the Letters of J.R.R. Tolkien. Penguin published it. It's in paperback. If you're a Tolkien fan, as I am, it's worth the $16 to sit there and look at the letters, his responses to people's letters about the world around him, and then goes until about his death, and talks about the various experiences and characters and theology and good versus evil. But to Tolkien, this idea of good versus evil comes out of his classical background of the mythology of the Middle Ages, but it's also something that he experienced. And this destruction of nature, environment, this destruction of beauty, is a theme that plays throughout, and it's destruction by. And so if we look at, and that's what he sees on the battlefields of World War I, and in The Lord of the Rings, we see this with Saruman and the Ents. It's very clear, right? And Peter Jackson does a wonderful job of when Saruman turns Isengard, right, into producing uruks and orcs and chopping down trees, and you see the smoke and the machines that are built, and his attack on Helm's Deep has machines. This all comes out of Tolkien's personal experiences and his perceptions of the dangers of modern society and industrialization. He was a romantic, and he lived very much in the past, but he also stationed that industrialization scale of what we wrought on human society. And so there's my short treatise on Tolkien the Great.
Awesome.
Hope I didn't go too long.
Not at all. Can we say thank you? It's for questions.
As much as you want.
Sorry.
What do you see in respect to the Great War and all wars since then for my grandson there in the year 30?
What do I see in terms of? I'm sorry, I missed the other.
Future.
As a historian, I study the past, so I don't do predictions well. I have good guesses sometimes. I've been pretty good at guessing on the, but in terms of what the future holds, I don't know. I don't have a palantir. Yeah, Drew would know better. He's got a closer line to the person.
I appreciate your guidance. It's taken us all of Europe. I love the history of World War II and so forth.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
And this will bring us pre-World War I, but I know it's a period you study. For me, some of the greatest scenes in the movies and the books are the massive cavalry charges. Can you say something about what historically what a cavalry charge of that scale would be like for?
Sure. The charge that those who saw the movie or read the books, right? The charge that rode Hiram at Pelennor Fields, it would be in the Return of the King book or the movie. That's about 5,000-6,000 Roman cavalry charging. And certainly there are plenty of examples in history where we have Battle of Agincourt, 20,000 French armored knights charging against very famous in Henry V, the Shakespeare play. We have 1807, French cap 15th, the Russian army in Battle of Eylau, February 1807. So for the participants, certainly for the cavalry, the horsemen, this is what it's all about. This is what they train for. But of course, the reality is, and I'm a New York City boy, so I don't know what it's like to ride a horse or charge. You don't go at full gallop from the start. It's basically the last 50 yards is at full gallop. So it makes it interesting to watch a horse walk for like a half mile before they start the charge. But for the participant, the cavalrymen, the horsemen, it's very exciting, and they understand that it's the mass, it's the weight, and it's the fear because thousands of horses, and that's going to scare the guy standing on the other side. And so I think in the scene, surprise the orcs turn to see the fear in their eyes. That's pretty accurate, especially for certain, let's say, certain things that were done tactically over the course of history. If you're on the receiving end of a massive cavalry charge and you're an infantryman, a foot soldier, then you have like at Agincourt where they put stakes out in front of the Indians so that the French armored knights can't charge into the position because then they end up impaling themselves and their horses on the stakes. We saw the movie Braveheart, they sort of stole from Braveheart. Or in the 18th and 19th century, they would form a formation called square, where the units would form into a square bristling with pikes, and horses are smart enough to know not to charge into a bristling formation with bayonets. So there were certain formations that were achieved to stop the cavalry charge, became very highly disciplined infantry, being attacked by thousands of heavy cavalry, even hundreds of cavalry. If you were not prepared, is logically devastating and usually resulted in a rout. You were safer if you could form into a square or a formation to receive the charge than if you broke and ran, because then it's rabbit season, as Elmer Fudd would say.
Any other questions? If you want to know your thoughts on Rings of Power being filmed,
it's better that better I not say it in a. No, I was actually I was with some friends yesterday, as Drew knows, and as great a Tolkien fan as I am, and we were lamenting Rings of Power. After I watched the first episode, I think I posted. I said Jeff Bezos with $1 billion did what Melko Kudoy Tolkien's Middle Earth. But it's interesting because for those who watched Rings of Power and enjoyed it, my eldest loves the movies, but never read the book despite my attempts to do it. He actually enjoyed Rings of Power, and what I found is if you have only seen the movies, you don't know the Tolkien history, and therefore it's entertainment and you're enjoying it. But if you are a Tolkien fan who has read the Silmarillion, read Unfinished Tales, knows the history of which there's a great deal, it stopped watching after 2.5 episodes because I found myself more angry at destroying something that I love. Because the Rings of Power takes place in what's called the Second Age of Middle Earth, right? Silmarillion that I just talked about. Lord of the Rings, Hobbit, Lord of the Rings is the Third Age of Middle Earth, and then there's the Second Age. And Tolkien wrote short stories about the Second Age and has a chronology of the Second Age, but did not really fill out the Second Age like he did the First or the Third. So when I first heard, my friends and I first heard that the Rings of Power were going to focus on Second Age, we thought, this is great, because Sauron does forge the rings according to Tolkien in this, and there's a war between Sauron and the elves. There's enough there of parameter, but not enough that it gives the writers the freedom to play with it. But what happened was they completely dispensed with anything that Tolkien had, and as a result, they just made it up. And have orcs, and you have Sauron, and you have Numenorians, and they all exist in the Second Age, and as they should. But the entire storyline, Tolkien is epic. It's epic story, and how many of you have seen Rings of Power? Okay, well, sorry, but so and for the rest of you, your life, important things to do. But one of my colleagues said to me, I want to see these grand storylines. I don't care if Erendil's daughter goes to architecture school. And that's a serious plot line. They happen. It's true. This is not, this is not Numenor. We're not interested. Tolkien's, these are grand stories and myths, and you're not dealing with, emotional trauma.